Happiness is the aim of life, but not fleeting pleasure or fortune. True happiness is found in the activity of the soul aligned with virtue. We become just by doing just acts, courageous by acting with courage. Virtue is a habit, not a gift. It is learned through choice, shaped by reason. The good life is a life of balance, what I call the golden mean, choosing wisely between excess and deficiency. Reason is our highest faculty, and it must govern desire and action. We are not isolated beings. We flourish in community through friendship, justice, and shared purpose. To live well is to live with purpose, guided by reason, and dedicated to what is excellent. This is the life of fulfillment. This is the life of a human being.
What does it mean to live well? Is it success, money, pleasure, peace of mind, or possibly is it something deeper? These questions haunted the ancient world as much as they haunt us today. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, set out to answer these questions, not by dreaming up a perfect utopia, but by observing real human life. And when you put his work in conversation with Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, you begin to see two different but complementary visions of what it takes to thrive as a human. Aristotle gives us a roadmap for flourishing in community, and Epictetus reminds us to carry armor for when the world fails us. Hello everyone, I'm Alice. I'm a homeless content creator who's been homeless for about 5 years, going on 6 now, and I'm going over philosophy and books suggested by PewDiePie to see how I can not only change my own personal mental outlook on life, but also how I can possibly change my life for the better in of itself. With that said, today we're looking at Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, and we'll be comparing and contrasting this to Stoicism from Epictetus. I wanted to write this out more so as a conversation between both of them, but I'm not yet informed enough on either topic to do so, so instead I'll offer a more narrative contrast in this video. With the intro out of the way, let's jump into the rest of the video. Aristotle begins Nicomachean Ethics with a simple but powerful question. What is the ultimate goal of life? He points out that everything we do aims at some good. We study to gain knowledge, we work to earn money, we exercise to stay healthy, but all of these things are a means to an end. They're stepping stones towards something further. So the real question is, what is the end of ends? What is the thing that we seek for its own sake and not for something else? For Aristotle, the ultimate goal is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but a better word is flourishing or living well. Unlike fleeting pleasure or passing good mood, eudaimonia is a whole life achievement. It is a state of a life well lived where your actions, character, and purpose all align. It's not about how you feel in one moment, it's about whether your life as a whole expresses the best of human nature. Aristotle states this plainly. Eudaimonia is the good life, a life of virtuous activity in accordance with reason. This is where he differs from a lot of modern thinking. In our current culture, happiness is often reduced to pleasure, comfort, or success. The Stoics, like Epictetus, would also push back against that very thought. They'd say pleasure and pain come and go. True peace comes from living according to nature and reason. So while Aristotle and Epictetus don't necessarily fully agree, Aristotle grounds happiness in both internal virtue and external goods, while Epictetus insists happiness is purely in your own control. Both force us to move beyond shallow, feel-good definitions of happiness. To define the good life, Aristotle asked, what is the unique function of a human being? Every tool and creature has a function. A knife's function is to cut, a horse's function is to run, a flute player's function is to play music. So what about us? For Aristotle, the distinctive function of humans is reason, the ability to think, deliberate, and guide our lives with rational choice. Therefore, the good life is the one where we exercise reason well, not just having thoughts, but living with excellent reasoning and virtuous action. That, according to Aristotle, is eudaimonia, the flourishing that comes from using our own human function to its fullest. Aristotle critiques 3 popular views of happiness in his time, views that are arguably just as common today. The first is a life of pleasure. Some say happiness is found in maximizing pleasure. Netflix binges, endless parties, consumer luxuries. Aristotle calls this a life fit for beasts. It reduced humans to animals chasing comfort. The second is the life of wealth. Others think happiness is about money, but wealth, Aristotle points out, is just a means to an end. No one wants piles of cash just to stare at it. We want it for what it can buy, so it can't be the ultimate good. The third is the life of honor. Another group ties happiness to status and recognition, but honor depends on other people. It's not fully in our control, and Aristotle reminds us the highest good should be something stable, self-sufficient, and permanently lasting. This critique arguably sounds strikingly modern. Today, people equate happiness with likes on social media, career milestones, or luxury lifestyles, but Aristotle's question still cuts through. If these things can be taken away so easily, how can they be the highest good? Epictetus arguably would nod along here. He reminds us constantly that external goods, wealth, health, reputation, lie outside of our control. To base happiness on them is to chain your well-being to a fortune's wheel. But here's where the two diverge. Aristotle does not think that external goods play some role. You can't live fully flourishing if you're living in extreme poverty or severe illness, because you won't have the stability needed to practice virtue well. Epictetus, by contrast, insists that even a slave in chains can live the good life if they master their own judgments. The balance between them two is very powerful. Epictetus insists that freedom is internal. Nothing external can define your happiness, and Aristotle would argue that flourishing requires virtue, but is also enriched by the right conditions. So what exactly does that mean for us today? Think about how much energy people pour into chasing pleasure, wealth, or status. All of the things that Aristotle said can't be the ultimate good. Social media amplifies this. We're told happiness is in the next gadget, the next trip, the next follower milestone. But Aristotle asks, what if happiness isn't the next thing, but in how you live day to day, and whether you're practicing courage, justice, and wisdom? Modern psychology actually echoes this. Positive psychology studies show that people report the deepest satisfaction not from momentary pleasures, but from experiences of meaning and engagement. What psychologist Mihail, I cannot say the last name, so I'm just going to put it on screen. This is what Mihail called flow. That is Aristotle's eudaimonia in action, fulfillment through active excellence. Think of the movie Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith. The character, Chris Gardner, struggles through poverty and hardship. He seeks money and stability, yes, but the story shows that his deepest fulfillment isn't wealth. It's found in his perseverance, his dedication to his son, his pursuit of excellence in his craft. That would be eudaimonia. Flourishing is not just about outcomes, but in the way you live. Another good example is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Miles Morales doesn't achieve flourishing by gaining powers or fame. His growth comes from stepping into the role responsibly, aligning his actions with courage, wisdom, and justice. His flourishing is about being who he was meant to be. So Aristotle's answer to the question, what is the ultimate goal of life, is not pleasure, it's not wealth, it's not honor, but a life of flourishing, a life where we practice virtue and exercise reason in alignment with our nature. This sets the stage for the rest of the Nicomachean ethics, because once we know what the goal is, eudaimonia, the next question is, how do we actually achieve it? That's where Aristotle introduces his famous doctrine of virtues, the muscles of the soul that help us live in balance. For Aristotle, the heart of flourishing life is virtue. But when we hear that word today, we often think of it as some abstract moral checklist. Be nice, don't lie, donate to charity. Aristotle had something far deeper in mind. To him, virtue isn't about following rules, it's about becoming a certain kind of person. He calls virtue a hexis, a state or disposition of the soul, built through repetition and practice. In other words, you're not born virtuous, you don't become virtuous overnight. Instead, you train it, the same way you train your body in the gym. Think of it just like this. Just the same as lifting weights, building physical muscle. Making good choices over and over again builds moral muscle. Every time you resist an impulse to lash out in anger, every time you practice honesty when lying would be easier, every time you choose moderation instead of indulgence, you're doing a quote-unquote rep for your soul. But Aristotle adds a significant twist. Virtue isn't just about going to the extremes, it's about fighting the golden mean, that sweet spot between deficiency and excess. A good example is courage. If you have too little courage, you're a coward. If you have too much courage, you're reckless. True courage lies in balance, facing fear when it's appropriate, but not seeking out danger for its own sake. Another good example is generosity. Too little and you're stingy, too much and you're wasteful. True generosity lies in giving wisely, when and where it matters. Even with something like humor, too little and you're dour, too much and you're frivolous. The virtuous person knows how to laugh at the right things at the right time. Aristotle makes it clear, virtue isn't about killing off emotion, but disciplining it. He says the good person doesn't feel nothing, they feel the right things at the right time in the right way. And this is where he contrasts with Epictetus. The Stoics lean toward suspicion of passion. For them, emotions were dangerous, storms that needed to be quiet. Aristotle, on the other hand, saw passions as raw energy, like fire. If they're left unchecked, fire burns down the house. But if it's harnessed correctly, it cooks your food and warms your home. A good modern parallel is anger. Online, we're constantly told to stay calm and don't let it get to you. Epictetus would agree, anger usually hijacks your reason, but Aristotle would ask, what are you actually angry about? Is it trivial, like someone cutting you off in traffic, or is it injustice, exploitation, or cruelty? Because in those cases, anger might actually be the right virtuous response, so long as it's channeled constructively. Another one is discipline. In fitness culture, we hear the phrase muscle memory. The more you practice an exercise, the more natural it becomes. Virtue works the same way. A disciplined person doesn't have to antagonize over whether or not to work out, or whether to tell the truth. It becomes second nature. This is what Aristotle meant when he said that virtue is about habituation. You become just by doing the acts. You become courageous by acting courageously. Over time, your choices shape your character until excellence starts to feel natural. Compare this again with Epictetus. For him, the practice is more about internal detachment, guarding your mind from false judgments, refusing to be enslaved by the externals. Aristotle doesn't deny this inner work, but he grounds virtue in action within society. For him, you can't really become virtuous on a desert island. You need other people, other situations, real challenges to practice with. And this is where the metaphor of muscle memory really shines. No athlete trains to avoid resistance. They seek it out. Likewise, Aristotle reminds us that virtue is tested in friction of life, in relationships, in setbacks, in daily choices. Without resistance, there is no growth. A good modern tie-in is the workplace. You don't develop patience sitting alone. You develop it in meetings that drag on too long. You don't cultivate honesty in theory. You cultivate it when telling the truth that could cost you something. You don't learn courage by reading about it. You learn it by speaking up when it's unpopular or standing firm when it's risky. Just like with physical training, virtue demands consistency. One workout doesn't make you fit. One act of courage doesn't make you courageous. It's the steady, repeated practice of virtue over years that sculpts the soul into something excellent. So, for Aristotle, virtue is not about sainthood or perfection. It's about the slow, deliberate shaping of your character day by day until your choices reflect the kind of person you become. In short, virtue is the muscle of the soul, and like any muscle, it only grows if you use it. Aristotle believed that living a good life isn't just about memorizing a set of rules or following a strict formula. Instead, he introduces the idea of Phronesis, often translated as practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is different from book smarts or raw intelligence. It's not about acing exams or having endless trivia knowledge. It's the ability to navigate the messy, unpredictable situations of life with good judgment. Think of it like this: two people can both know what honesty is, but one might blurt out a harsh truth at the wrong time, while another understands when honesty should be paired with kindness. The second person is exercising phronesis, not just knowing the virtue, but knowing how and when to apply it. Aristotle famously describes virtue as a mean between extremes. But Aristotle warns this mean isn't a perfect middle point you can measure with a ruler. It's not like courage always equals 5 on a 1 to 10 bravery scale. It depends on context, timing, and individual capacity. For example, giving away $100 might be generous for a teenager working a part-time job, but barely noticeable for a millionaire. The action only becomes virtuous when it's guided by the right intention, proportional to your situation, and applied wisely. This is why Aristotle says virtues must be practiced and shaped by reason. It's not a math problem, it's an art form. Here's where Epictetus comes in as an interesting contrast. Epictetus says our main task is to use reason to clearly distinguish between what is in our control and what is not. For him, judgment is about stripping away the illusions. If you see something clearly, the right action follows naturally. Aristotle, however, adds more nuance. He agrees reason is central, but he emphasizes that life's decisions are rarely black and white. It's not always obvious what the right action is. You need a kind of moral intuition sharpened by experience, and that is what he calls phronesis. So while Epictetus gives us clarity through discipline, don't get upset about what you can't control, Aristotle gives us flexibility. In what you can control, act wisely and balance competing goods. Together, these perspectives complement each other. The Stoic helps us stay steady, and Aristotle helps us act skillfully in the gray zones. Let's bring this down to real life. Imagine you're a manager at work and your employee makes a big mistake. If you're too harsh, you might humiliate them and crush morale. If you're too lenient, you risk letting bad habits slide. The wise path, the virtuous mean, requires you to balance justice with compassion, accountability with encouragement. No handbook can tell you the perfect ratio here. You need phronesis, judgment developed through experience, reflection, and self-awareness. Or, if you think about social media, maybe you want to speak your mind on a controversial issue. But is it the right time? Is your tone respectful? Or is it adding noise and division? Aristotle would say wisdom isn't about silence or loudness. It's about knowing the right words at the right time in the right way. This is why Aristotle insists that ethics isn't just theory, it's a practice, a habit of applying reason to real-world complexity. Practical wisdom is what keeps virtues alive and prevents them from becoming empty slogans. A modern example might be the doctors during the pandemic. They constantly face moral dilemmas, limited resources, frightened patients, competing obligations. There isn't a one-size-fits-all rule book for these situations. What they need is phronesis, the ability to deliberate well, act in balance, and make decisions that serve both truth and compassion. Epictetus might remind them not to despair over the things outside of their control, like the spread of disease, but Aristotle would emphasize the responsibility to act wisely in what is in their control, how they allocate care, how they comfort families, and how they use their knowledge responsibly. So Aristotle arguably shows that life isn't solved by a formula. We can't just memorize virtues, we have to practice them with judgment, learning from mistakes and refining our sense of balance. Epictetus can hold us steady, but Aristotle pushes us to engage with complexity rather than retreat from it. And this leads us naturally into the next part. If virtues and wisdoms are practices, then how do we actually live them out day to day? For Aristotle, friendship isn't just a side note in ethics. It's actually arguably central to living a flourishing life. In fact, he dedicates 2 whole books of Nicomachean ethics to the subject. Why? Because no one, no matter how virtuous, lives in isolation. Happiness for Aristotle isn't just about cultivating your own soul. It's about sharing that life with others. He even says, without friends, no one would choose to live, even if they had all of the other goods. Aristotle breaks friendship into 3 categories. Number 1 is a friendship of utility. These are based on mutual benefit. Business partners, study groups, or political allies. They're not bad, but they dissolve once the usefulness ends. The second is friendships of pleasure. These are built on shared enjoyment, drinking buddies, gaming friends, or people you hang out with because it's fun. They last as long as the pleasure does. And the third is friendships of virtue. These, Aristotle considers the highest form of friendship. These are based on mutual admiration for each other's character. You love the other person not for what they can give you or how they make you feel, but because of who they are at their core. These friendships are rare, but Aristotle says that these are the most fulfilling because they reflect and reinforce our pursuit of the good life. Here's Aristotle's beautiful metaphor. A true friend is like a mirror of your soul. A true friend is indicative of who you truly are. Why? Because when you see a good friend act with courage, generosity, or wisdom, it inspires you to do the same. You witness your own values reflected back at you, sharpened by their example. In this way, friendship isn't just companionship, it's a form of ethical training. Friends help us cultivate virtue in a way books and lectures never can. Remember in part 3 when we talked about phronesis, practical wisdom, as the skill of navigating life's gray areas? Well, this is the connection. Friendship is one of the testing grounds, if not the testing ground, for practical wisdom. Think about it. A friend calls you late night venting about their breakup. Do you give blunt advice? Do you just listen? Do you drive over with ice cream? There's no formula. It requires judgment, empathy, and balance, the very essence of phronesis. Or consider when a friend is spiraling into destructive behavior. Do you respect their autonomy and stay quiet, or do you risk the friendship by intervening? Again, no rule book can decide this for you. It takes practical wisdom to act in a way that is both caring and courageous. So in Aristotle's view, friendship is where virtue and wisdom get tested in the real world because they are indeed a reflection of our own morals and virtues. Epictetus, though a Stoic, also emphasizes relationships, but in a different tone. He reminds us that other people's actions are ultimately always beyond our control. We can love and support them, but if we attach our happiness entirely to them, we risk despair when they falter or leave. Aristotle, by contrast, argues that friendship is essential to happiness itself. He's more relational. Virtue isn't just practice alone, it's nurtured in community. The two views don't actually cancel each other out. They arguably balance. Epictetus keeps us steady, reminding us not to cling too tightly to what isn't ours, and Aristotle reminds us that real flourishing happens when we invest deeply in others, knowing that life is richest when it is lived together. If you fast forward to today's world of digital connections, social media gives us thousands of friends, but how many of those are friendships of pleasure or utility? Rarely do we find friendships of virtue. Think about how rare it is to have someone who calls you out when you're straying from your values, who celebrates your growth rather than envies it, who stands by you not for benefits but because they admire who you are. These friendships are rare, but when we find them, they shape us. They're the relationships that polish our character like a mirror, reflecting back the best version of ourselves and sometimes the parts we need work on. Take the Lord of the Rings. Sam and Frodo's bond isn't just utility, though Sam does carry Frodo when he can't walk. And it's not just pleasure. The journey is literally anything but fun. It is quite literally a friendship of virtue. Sam mirrors Frodo's courage and resilience, reminding him of his better self when despair and hopelessness threatens to take over.
With my waking eyes, then let us be rid of it. Once and for all. Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you.
Another example is the TV show The Good Place. The characters grow morally only because of their friendships. Chidi's philosophical knowledge means nothing until it's tested in his messy relationships with Eleanor and the others. Practical wisdom and virtue flourish in friendship, not in isolation. So friendship for Aristotle isn't just about having company, it's about growing together in virtue, using the mirror of another soul to refine your own. And here's the deeper insight. Friendship and practical wisdom are literally inseparable. To be a good friend, you need judgment. To develop judgment, you need the feedback and reflection only friends can provide. That's why Aristotle says the path to happiness, to true eudaimonia, is never walked alone. One of the richest sections of Nicomachean ethics is Aristotle's treatment of friendship. Aristotle claims these friendships are essential for flourishing, that you can live without them. Humans by nature are social animals, and true friendship is where we reflect, refine, and realize our best selves. Aristotle contrasts sharply with Epictetus here. Stoics often warn against dependency. If you love too much, you might suffer when loss comes. Aristotle doesn't deny the risk, he insists the risk is worth it. Friendship is not a luxury, it's a necessity. In an age of loneliness, curated Instagram personas, and shallow connections, Aristotle's call for deep, virtuous friendships is arguably revolutionary. Flourishing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in community. Aristotle makes a arguably bold claim in Nicomachean ethics. Human beings by nature are political animals. Now, when we hear political, most of us think elections, partisan debates, or endless arguments on Twitter. But for Aristotle, politics isn't about party lines or government squabbles. It's about something deeper, the way humans live together in communities, shaping a shared life. He says that none of us can flourish in isolation. Unlike animals who can survive with mere instinct, humans require language, cooperation, and shared norms to fully realize their potential, and because of this, the highest good for an individual is inseparable from the good of the community. For Aristotle, the polis, that is, the city-state, is not just a convenience, but the natural habitat of human beings. Just as fish need water and birds need air, humans need community. Why? Because flourishing isn't just about private virtue. It's about the practice of virtue with others. Courage, justice, generosity. These only make sense when exercised in relationships and society. Take justice, for example. You can't be just on a deserted island. Justice requires others. It requires laws, responsibilities, and shared understanding. So to Aristotle, the good life requires more than self-mastery. It requires contributing to the life of the community. This is one of the sharpest contrasts with Stoicism. Epictetus would say, focus only on your own inner world. Don't tie your well-being to politics because governments, laws, and communities are outside your control. For him, the philosopher could flourish even in slavery cut off from public life. Aristotle wouldn't deny that inner virtue matters most, but he insists that humans cannot flourish cut off from society. For him, the person who withdraws from the community isn't fully human. They're either a beast or a god. This tension between both of these moral philosophies is arguably pretty fascinating. Epictetus teaches us resilience in isolation, while Aristotle reminds us that full flourishing is relational. Perhaps the mean is this: when the world forces you into solitude, Stoicism can keep you steady. But in ordinary life, our fulfillment is magnified and completed through community. Think about how modern culture often tells us happiness is purely individual. You do you, find your truth, live your best life. Self-care is marketed as shutting everyone out, but Aristotle would challenge that. He'd ask, can you really flourish without deep ties to others, without contributing to something larger than yourself? And modern science backs him up. Studies in psychology show that strong relationships and a sense of belonging are among the most powerful predicators of well-being. In fact, the longest running study of human happiness, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, concludes that close relationships more than wealth or fame keep people happy and healthy. That's Aristotle's whole point. Flourishing is communal. Look at the Black Panther. T'Challa isn't just flourishing because of his personal virtues. His identity is bound to Wakanda, to its traditions, to his responsibility as king. His struggles to be just, to be courageous, to be wise all play out in the arena of politics and community. His flourishing is inseparable from the flourishing of his people. Or, going back to the Lord of the Rings, Frodo's mission only makes sense because of the Fellowship, because of the wider community fighting for Middle-earth. His personal courage matters, but it's magnified and completed within the bonds of friendship, loyalty, and a shared cause. That is Aristotle's polis in action. So for Aristotle, politics isn't about just laws and powers. It's about the conditions that allow people to flourish together. Good laws, good education, and good institutions cultivate virtue in citizens. Bad ones corrupt them. A tyrant warps the characters of people, while a just ruler helps them grow. In that sense, politics is not separate from ethics. It's ethics scaled up to a mass scale. Ethics asks, how should I live? Politics asks, how should we live together? This is an idea that's often forgotten today, where politics is reduced to gamesmanships or policy debates. But for Aristotle, politics is sacred because it shapes the soil in which human virtue either grows or withers. So when Aristotle says we're political animals, he's not pushing us to obsess over our headlines or argue endlessly on social media. He's reminding us that our lives are bound up with one another. Our flourishing depends on the flourishing of our communities, and just as virtues shape the soul of an individual, politics shapes the soul of the people. When Aristotle turns to pleasure, he knows he's treading on tricky ground. People either worship it, chasing comfort, indulgence, and constant stimulation, or they condemn it, treating it as a distraction or even a sin. But Aristotle, he takes a much more balanced approach. For him, pleasure is not the good, but it is an inseparable part of the good life. The key distinction he makes is this: pleasure is good when it flows naturally from virtuous activity, but destructive when it becomes the goal in of itself. Think of it like this. Imagine two people. One spends hours binge watching shows, eating junk food, scrolling endlessly. The person may be pleasured out in the moment, but usually they feel much worse afterwards, sluggish, regretful, and maybe even empty. Another person spends hours training for a marathon, rehearsing a song, or working on a business project they deeply care about. Yes, it is hard. Yes, it is tiring. But when they finish, they feel a sense of joy, accomplishment, and even elevation because they have contributed something to others. Aristotle would say that the second kind of pleasure is the one tied to flourishing. It is the pleasure of excellence. Epictetus would have clapped here because he also warned against pleasures that enslave. He wasn't anti-pleasure. He enjoyed food, laughter, companionship like any other person, but he insisted that you should never let pleasure rule you. As he put it, freedom is not achieved by satisfying desire, but by eliminating it, where Aristotle says pleasure is like the crown on the virtue. Epictetus is the guardrail reminding us not to be lured off the path. Together, they offer a vision of pleasure that is both fulfilling and disciplined. In our modern lives, we live in an age of hyper-pleasure algorithms that feed us videos we can't stop watching. Food scientists design snacks to be addictive. Entire industries exist to sell us quick hits of dopamine. This creates what psychologists today call the pleasure trap. The more we chase these shallow pleasures, the less satisfying they become, and the more we feel that we need. But Aristotle would say, this isn't real happiness. It's a distraction dressed up as happiness. Genuine joy comes not from passive consumption, but from activity that expresses our best selves. This is why athletes often say their hardest workouts are also their most rewarding. Why gamers talk about the flow when mastering a difficult level, it feels exhilarating. Why creative people sometimes lose themselves in hours of writing, painting, or coding and come out tired, but they are profoundly much more satisfied. To Aristotle, the good life is not choosing between pleasure and discipline, it's about uniting them. Pleasure is at its highest when it flows naturally from living virtuously, from striving towards excellence. Think of it as a feedback loop. The better you live, the richer your pleasure becomes. And here's the kicker. The right pleasures also strengthen the soul. When you enjoy learning, you crave wisdom. When you enjoy kindness, you crave connection. When you enjoy discipline, you crave growth. Pleasure, when aligned with virtue, doesn't corrupt, it amplifies. So when Aristotle talks about pleasure, he isn't giving us a license to indulge in everything, nor is he telling us to repress ourselves. He's telling us to redirect pleasure towards what makes us flourish. Instead of running from it or worshiping it, we train it like a wild horse to carry us forward on the journey to Eudamonia. After walking us through the virtues of character, the role of community, the importance of politics, Aristotle brings us to the peak of his ethical vision, contemplation. To him, all the practices of virtue, all the efforts of justice, courage, friendship, are scaffolding leading us towards something higher, the life of the mind. Why? Because Aristotle says the thing that is most distinctly human is our capacity for reason. Other creatures share in appetite and instinct, even in social bonds, but the ability to reflect, to ask questions, to seek truth, that is uniquely human. And if virtue is about fulfilling our function well, then the fullest, most excellent human life is one spent exercising reason at its highest level, in philosophy, in science, in art, and in the search for wisdom. Aristotle describes contemplation, theoria, as the activity closest to the divine. Gods don't need to deliberate or act in the messy world of politics and trade. Their perfection lies in pure thought. And when humans contemplate truth, whether in mathematics, metaphysics, or simply reflecting on the meaning of life, we come closest to sharing in that divine activity. That is why he says contemplation is the highest happiness, not because politics or friendships are unimportant, they are essential, but because contemplation touches something eternal. It is as though the practical virtues keep us upright and balanced, but contemplation lets us see the stars. Here we find an interesting meeting point with Stoicism. Epictetus also emphasizes the inner life, but for him, philosophy is less abstract, contemplation, and more about practical resilience, about training the will and shaping the self, becoming unshakable. Aristotle doesn't dismiss this, but he wants more. For him, flourishing isn't about resilience, it's about fulfillment. And that means stretching the mind towards the highest truths we can grasp. In a way, Epictetus helps us endure life, and Aristotle teaches us to transcend it. So how do we apply this to today? After all, most of us don't have the luxury of spending our days like Greek philosophers under olive trees. Aristotle isn't saying you need to abandon your job and retreat into meditation. He's saying make room for contemplation. In the chaos of modern life, with constant notifications, endless streaming, and news cycles, carving out time for stillness, reflection, and deep thought is revolutionary. It could be reading a profound book, journaling about your values, meditating, or even just walking without headphones, allowing your mind to wander. This is why so many people today are drawn to practices like mindfulness, philosophy reading groups, or even the resurgence of slow movements. Slow moving, slow media, slow living, slow food. They're all attempts to reclaim space for contemplation in a distracted age. And the benefits aren't just a spiritual matter. Studies show that practices like deep reflection and meditation improve focus, emotional regulation, and even physical health. In other words, contemplation is not just noble, it's practical. Think of films like The Tree of Life or Interstellar. These movies don't just tell stories, they invite us into contemplation. They make us pause and reflect on time, existence, love, and the cosmos. Or look at Doctor Strange. At first, Stephen Strange is all ego and ambition, but his true power comes not from skill alone, but from learning to slow down, to reflect, to see beyond himself into the nature of reality. That is Aristotle's contemplative life in cinematic form. Even in more grounded stories like Good Will Hunting, we see this theme. Real growth isn't about technical ability or practical success. but about stopping to ask the deeper questions: who am I? What matters? And how should I live? Of course, Aristotle isn't naive. He doesn't think everyone can spend all their time contemplating, nor does he think that we should. That's why his ethics emphasize balance. Politics, friendship, virtue, and action, these remain central. But he does think that contemplation is the crown of human life, the activity that makes all of the rest worthwhile. It gives us perspective, meaning, and connection to something larger than ourselves. So where does this leave me now? For myself, the engagement with philosophy of the ages has helped me find reason and satisfaction even in the mundane, or the daily. I think that's worth something. From Tao Te Ching, I found reason to let go of life and enjoy it for what it is, for each moment it gives me. I definitely still struggle with this one, but I am learning and trying, and I think that's the point. From Buddha's words, I've found reason to seek enjoyment and fulfillment, which of course so far has led me to Epictetus's Stoicism, which has helped me reflect on how I view myself in the world. And now, with Aristotle's words, it's time for me to reflect on how I view relationships and how I bring a better me to the service of others. If Epictetus shows us how to endure, Aristotle shows us how to flourish. And between them, they offer not just ancient wisdom, but a guidebook for living well, right here and right now. Thank you everyone for watching thus far. I appreciate it a lot. If you found value in this video, and thus my journey through philosophy, drop a comment below with your favorite quote or insight, or maybe another book that I should look at, and let me know how you might apply this wisdom to your daily life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell for more videos on following my own journey with philosophy. Remember, philosophy isn't just something you read, it's something you do. Until next time, stay grounded, stay rational, and keep growing.